Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our weekly ship show. My name is Jason Brand, and I am the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. So this week, prepare yourself for a knowledge gavage about what's happening in India and how they are caught in the crosshairs of a situation that's really affecting the entire global shipping market. So I hope I caught you right after lunch. And if you're still eating it, that's fantastic. But make sure you chug that coffee now because I want you to focus for the next 15 minutes while I give you some highlights on this topic. And the goal here is for you to walk away with a little bit more knowledge of kind of what's going on right now. There's a lot of facets. We're entering kind of a unique era that I don't think any of us thought we'd enter this quickly and to this extreme, but we're going to try to focus around India here. That being said, I've got to put a couple stakes in the ground, just talking about some broad events going on, just so you kind of have something to compare it to and really to see that underlying message. Because yes, we're talking about India, but the underlying message of this show today is congestion in the global shipping lanes. So keep these points I'm going to mention front and center as we run through it today. So first, if you were with us last week, we discussed this a little bit, but the ILA negotiations, they have been heating up. They're headed in the wrong direction, and a strike is very, very likely for September 30th. Now, the reason why, during the ILWU negotiations, we really didn't say a strike was all that likely. This is very different, and the way they're going about it this time is also very different. They've made it clear from the beginning, if an agreement isn't signed by September 30th, that they would strike. And that is something major that will be affecting the global markets in general. And if you've got a container that is going to be scheduled to be coming in after September 30th, and it's coming into the U.S. East Coast or Gulf, you really need to be careful and make sure you're going to a port where there won't be a strike. That being said, the ports that are not union controlled are likely going to be the most congested as well. So keep that in mind. Make sure you're planning around that because September 30th is coming up, especially if you're ocean shipping with those lead times. Now, second, we've got these peak season surcharges, and they're here and they're here early. They came roughly a month early from last year and from normal. And the rate increases with these peak season surcharges are about double what they normally are. And, to add a third thing is those rates are actually sticking because there is a negotiation period when these peak season surcharges are released and announced. And quite frankly, they're sticking right now. So that is a pretty clear sign. Well, there's actually one other factor that's a clear sign here. So when you look at the vessel charter rates, and when I talk about vessel charter rates, I'm essentially talking about, if an ocean carrier wants to quick inject some capacity and they want to lease a couple ships, that's the vessel charter rates I'm talking about. Well, those rates have doubled since last November. So when you pair that with the peak season surcharges being twice as high, coming earlier and sticking, with also the vessel charter rates doubling since last November, you've got a pretty clear sign there's a big imbalance we're dealing with between the supply in the market and the demand in the market. So finally, ocean carriers, if you're traveling between Asia and Europe, now we talked about this lane a lot over the past month, 2 months even. It's been a really, really, really hot lane. We also obviously saw a surge of imports happen earlier this year coming into the U.S. West Coast, but the Asia to Europe lane has been incredibly hot as well. Remember, when I say that, it's there's a lot of obvious dilemmas going on in that lane that are soaking up capacity that give a kind of a false illusion of, you can't really compare it directly to years previous because we still have this Suez Canal issue. But if you're shipping on the Asia to Europe lane, and you're going around the tip of Africa, and you've got to avoid that Suez Canal still because of those Houthi militia attacks, shipping a 40-foot container, it was at a low point of $950. That's a 40-foot container, and that's back in November of last year. But the current rate we're seeing is around $7,000, and it is expected to continue to rise. So that same trend of skyrocketing rates, it's also happening to Indian inbound and outbound lanes. And unfortunately, it's coming with some unique complexity. So Rates from Chinese origins that are headed into India, they have surged dramatically in price as well over the last few weeks. A good example is spot rates from Shanghai to West India are currently sitting at $4,250 per 40-foot equivalent unit. And that's a very significant increase. That's up from 1,180 we were seeing just in May. Now, rates from Singapore to West India have also risen sharply. We're looking at 4,500 per 40-foot equivalent unit. And rates also from Japan to West India have rose. They're the highest we're seeing just for those inter-Asian rates at 4,800 per container. Now, we don't normally discuss these lanes. These are, this is very transshipment routes. But what makes them very notable right now and what makes them very important to be talked about is the current prices we're seeing, those prices I just mentioned, they're actually higher than the peak prices we were witnessing during the pandemic in those very same lanes. Now, obviously, the overall lane going from China all the way over to Europe, that is still about 50% what we saw as, I'd say, probably the high average, not the peak, but the high average. We were seeing 14,000 for that lane during the pandemic. But these transshipment lanes, they are, substantially shorter routes, and they are higher than the peaks we were witnessing during the pandemic, which is something that is extremely notable and something that has to be recognized. Now, it has had a massive effect on the larger Indian exporters, of course, importers and exporters, but particularly those who have become reliant on Chinese import products. And despite that high freight cost they've been paying, they're still having trouble getting their containers on vessels in general. So this is kind of causing a cascading effect, and it's causing importers in the region to kind of restart the pandemic strategy of bulk ordering to try to build up their inventories and avoid stockouts. But they're doing this, and that's simultaneously adding to the congestion, and it's soaking up what little capacity there is available. So it is unfortunately kind of a vicious cycle that has already started occurring in the Indian region, and it's making it really bad, particularly for these smaller Indian importers. Now, this isn't all. When you take a look at how the ocean carriers have been managing their capacity during all of this, you do have this surge in this situation happening in India, but a lot of carriers are moving their capacity out of the region, and they're actually moving it over to the Chinese-US routes, over these kind of transshipment and Indian routes. Now, and that's not all, actually. Unfortunately, I hate to have bad news after bad news, but it is quite a situation. So also what's happening with Indian importers and exporters are there is a series of new fees and charges that are coming out. And a lot of those have actually already been rolled out, or they're rolling out this month. So this is what we're kind of viewing as the first clear sign of a ocean liner really admitting we have a bit of an empty container situation. So Hapag-Lloyd, they announced they're going to begin charging an equipment imbalance surcharge. They're calling that. You might see that pop up as an EIS, and it's going to be $300 per container. And this is specific to Indian bookings that are going to Europe, and that's going to be starting on July 1st. But that's not all. So CGM from the same date is implementing a different line item. They're calling that the emergency space surcharge. They're charging $500 per container for Indian loads to Europe, but also to the Mediterranean or North Africa. Finally, if you move over to MSC, and this is kind of wild. So on June 16th, they rolled out a GRI of $750 per container for Indian shipments headed to the U.S. East Coast or the U.S. Gulf Coast. Days later, they also announced an $1,000 per container hike on those same routes, but starting on July 6th. And that's not it. MSC also is instituting the peak season surcharge, and that's going to be an additional $1,500 per container, and that is going to be taking effect on July 1st. So obviously, Indian importers and exporters are getting hit in all directions, and just the fact that it's difficult to get on a vessel in general is kind of adding salt to the wound there. So the concern here is, we've got a couple customers who've moved to India, and what is a consistent problem that we see when sourcing from India is that while it's a fantastic alternative to China, the upstream requirements of many manufacturers in India still heavily involve Chinese in Southeast Asia. So as a result, congestion issues that happen in those upstream regions and the vessel reliability schedules that tank through transshipment points or obviously further upstream in and around Malaysia, they have this massive domino effect on the Indian export market. And it just results in capacity getting pulled with these, carriers doing the same thing, shifting their boats to higher margin lanes. And it causes a lot of whiplash for countries or companies that are relying on these Indian made goods. But this is kind of where it gets exciting. So, what just happened just in the past month is India announced that they are planning on launching their own new state-owned shipping company. And they have a targeted fleet expansion of at least 1,000 ships over the next decade. One of the main goals here, and it was made very clear when this initiative was kind of brought out, was they want to reduce Indians' reliance on these foreign vessel operators. So they actually brought forth the 2019-2020 numbers, and they said, we spent $85 billion as a country on ocean shipping carriers. And we believe that number would have been closer to 75 or 70 billion I got to flip that actually. They believe 70 to 75 billion of that was unnecessary expenses. Obviously, they're taking a huge stab at what they believe is just kind of fluff in those costs. But that being said, they believe they could have done that same amount of ocean shipping for around 15 billion if it would have been under a state-owned operator. Now, Prime Minister Modi, he has this vision that's been made very clear of transforming India into this developed nation by 2047. And with that comes a huge anticipated rise in freight costs. That expectation of hitting this point by 2047, they also believe will cost them from an ocean freight expense around 400 billion. Obviously, this is a rough number because you're kind of throwing a dart a little bit, but around 400 billion a year for ocean freight expenses. And they do believe that it's critical for them to build their own state-owned and operated ocean vessel company. I got to keep switching up these words so it doesn't just put everybody in a trance. But they believe this is a key initiative for them to create this company in order to make Indian exporters just competitive to the world. And that's on a lot of different levels. So a couple things here. India actually currently does have a fleet, and it's a fleet of around 1,500 large vessels. But the concern here is it has not kept pace with how much Indian manufacturers have been tapped in the last 5 to 10 years and how much more of a presence they have on the global trade stage. So, particularly if you look at the energy imports and refined oil sectors, they've kind of felt a little bit left behind. So India's oil and shipping ministries, they've actually focused on this. They created a joint working group, and they're going to be the ones that develop the roadmap for this new proposed shipping firm. And their goal here is making sure they have an industry-first approach when they're talking about how are we going to develop this company and what vessels are we going to be building and how are we going to deploy these vessels and so on and so forth. So the new shipping company, it's going to be based out of GIFT IFSC. It's a financial center I'm going to slaughter this one, but Gujarat. And it's going to benefit from a lot of financial incentives and also streamlined regulatory environments that they've kind of set up there. So seed capital is going to cost approximately $3.6 billion US dollars, and that's going to be sourced from a maritime development fund, which is in partnership with the major port authorities. In order to secure low-cost loans for the shipbuilding process, all the state-owned companies are going to be forced to sign 15-year charter deals with this new firm. And, this is actually pretty substantial because the Indian market is known for kind of doing this short-term booking practice. So 15 years in comparison to the short-term booking practice is kind of a complete flipped switch. But I personally am extremely excited about this change. And I'm really glad, actually, they're going to be pumping up their vessels because, as I mentioned before, unfortunately, we've got a lot of customers who've shifted over to India and more that are considering it. But it is this dilemma of, ocean vessel operators moving capacity out and then Indian exporters kind of getting, stuck holding the stick at the end where their reliability is down, their costs fluctuate too much, and it's just not been good for their growth trajectory. So really exciting to see this. There's also a couple changes that have come through some of the Indian routes, but we can get into that later. So I hope I hope you understand right now the severity of the situation when it comes to specifically all the touch points between the China and Europe lane, how those transshipment points are extremely congested, and how kind of India is being left out in the cold in this process. If you are shipping out of India, the good news is some of these, unfortunately, expensive changes will be leading to vessels coming back. But there's a lot of things that have to be sorted out in that process. So a little bit of a short-term problem. Let's put it that way. Anyway, thank you guys for joining us today. We got a lot going on, but next week we have got a great guest on our show. Look out for the email invites we're going to send. We're going to throw some marketing content up too, so you can see it. But looking forward to talking to you guys next week. Thank you.